Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And this is the fourth and kind of the last show in RAF week because we've had to postpone the show with Sarah Louise Miller about the intelligence for the Operation Chastise Dan Butter's raid. As soon as she's available again, I will reschedule that. I've kind of put a placeholder date on it, as sort of 10 days' time. It will shuffle around at some point. But right now, we are bringing RAF week to a kind of a temporary end. And then we've got a separate show tomorrow about Kokoda. We're back to New Guinea again with David W. Cameron joining us from Australia. That's been postponed again. And then next week, we are talking about artillery and things that go bang. But anyway, my guest today is Rob L. Wagner, a journalist and author who is here to tell us about NP711, a Halifax bomber and its crew lost in Germany in 1945. So I'll bring him in. Good afternoon, Rob. How are you today?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So we were just chatting before going live there about the different types of guests I have, and this is very much a personal story for you. You've come from a background of journalism, and you've traveled the world, you've written things, you've done some film production and things, but this story is very, very close to your heart. So before we bring up the PowerPoint and get on with it, what's the story's connection with yourself?
Well, I became interested in doing this documentary following a conversation I had with my cousin, Richard Wagner. His brother, Bill Wagner, was a wireless operator on Halifax Mark 7. And he was part of the NP711 crew that was killed in Germany. And he told me about his brother's story, and I became interested in what to do with this story. Richard and Bill's family and my family were very close in the pre-war years. They lived in Southern California. They were in the motion picture business. They lived in Hollywood. And Richard and Bill's family, their father was a cameraman for Warner Brothers. And my grandfather was a publicity agent for 20th Century Fox. So they were very close. And we had a bunch of cousins and uncles who were makeup artists and cameramen and writers and what have you. As the decades moved on and the older generation died, we lost touch with this family. Then in the late 80s, Richard wrote to my grandmother and reconnected. My grandmother was nearing 90 at the time, so she asked me to correspond with him, which I did. And we wrote each other for 4 or 5 years. Then in 1991, I went to see Richard at his home in Connecticut, and that's when he told me the story of his brother. What was interesting was that he didn't have very many details. He learned that his brother had the aircraft that his brother was in had crashed on a hillside in Germany in heavy fog. And later on, before his brother had passed away, he told me that his brother had a premonition of his own death. Those are only details he knew. I didn't know what to do with this story. And I did write an article in the mid-90s about it, but I didn't do it justice because I didn't have a lot of details. In the early 2000s, I written to the Canadian government in Ottawa for Bill's service record. I wasn't expecting much, but I did get a service record, and I got plenty of other material as well. I got letters from the Royal Canadian Air Force to the family, and most importantly, I got the investigative report. So now I knew exactly what had happened. It turned out that Richard didn't have the facts right, which is typical of families who lost loved ones during World War II. They just didn't know the details. So I wanted to tell this story. I still didn't know how to tell this story. I didn't want to write a book about it, and I didn't want to write an article about it. And eventually I decided that I'll do a documentary. And how I got to the documentary was Eric Vyman, who is who does battlefield excavations. He had recovered the wreckage of November Papa 711. And he invited me as a relative to the memorial service. And I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to tell the story and cover the memorial service at the same time. So I did this in 2022. I went to England and to Germany, did the documentary, and then it was released in January of this year.
And the link is in the description below, folks. And I think, having watched the film myself, it's typical of where we are like in this century, is it's a story told a modern way. You know, these stories wouldn't have been able to be told that way 40 years ago because you couldn't easily connect with people in Germany and around the world 40 years. It's the internet that has brought that kind of possibility together where you can just reach out and share things, and the fact that independent filmmakers can go to places with a light camera or even using their phones these days and make a documentary and bring all these resources of the local people who study the site, people like you, because our mutual friend Jane is in the film there, you know, a Halifax bomber expert. And it's a modern example of storytelling, and books is one way of doing it, films and documentaries, and YouTube of course is another way. So we'll fire up your PowerPoint, and then you tell me when you want me to move on. And folks,
Okay.
we'll do questions as we go along if they're about the slide or about the particular details of the people. But yeah, I'm just going to sit back and listen to Rob, and it's a really fascinating story.
Okay. This is a very personal story for me, as I said, and it's a story of the emotional strain and of flying operations. It's a story of fear, which is many crews consider the eighth passenger of a bomber. We discussed the final flight. In the documentary, we did a reconstruction of the crash, and we discussed the recovery of the crew's remains immediately after the crash. A lot of the documentary also focuses on the recovery of the wreckage 73 years later. It just sat there for 73 years, and nobody in the area, none of the community members of Leistadt and Bad Dürkheim, where this crash occurred, had visited the site or had recovered any of the wreckage. Go ahead, next slide. This crew served together as a unit in 11 operations over 75 days. That's better than many operations, or better than many crews. Some crews only lasted 1 or 2 operations together, and some went the full tour. So this crew was somewhere in the middle of serving together. To put this crew and what they had performed during the war, to put it in perspective, to give it a greater context, we can talk about the Group 6, which was part of this crew, that this crew was a member of. The crew was part of the 408 Goose Squadron, and it was based at Leistatt and is part of Group 6 Bomber Command. 1/3 of all Bomber Command air crews were Canadian. This number 6 group was formed in October 1942, and it was created to be staffed and manned completely by Canadian officers and airmen. They had a total of more than 40,000 operations during the war, and they dropped more than 126,000 tons of bombs, and they lost 814 aircraft. Next one. Next slide. To bring that down, to narrow that down a little bit, we have the 408 Squadron and what they performed during the war. The early years, they had Hamptons, which was a medium-sized bomber. In 43, I think it was, they switched to Lancasters. Then there was a big surge in manufacturing by Handley Page to bring back later model Halifaxes. These would be the Halifaxes Mark 7. And so they returned to the 408 Squadron and 6 Bomber Command in the summer of 1944. And at that time, the 408 moved to Leistatt Air Force Base in England and was part of the 6th Group. Overall, the 408 had flew 4,600 operations. They dropped more than 11,000 tons of bombs. They lost 170 aircraft, which is about 21% of the entire 6 Bomber Group. So they suffered heavy losses. And they lost 933 airmen, either killed, MIA, or taken as prisoners. They had received 200 decorations and had 11 battle honors. This is an image of the 408 in July 1944 when they received the bulk of their Mark 7s. Halifaxes did not have a good reputation in those early years. The Mark 1 and Mark 2s had severe rudder problems, and they had a tendency to spiral out of control, and they suffered heavy losses just by virtue of crashing without being involved in any operations. They also had Merlin engines, which were vastly underpowered, and the Mark I and Mark II really struggled to make a name for themselves. As a consequence, Halifax's casualties during the war were pretty high.
Yeah.
By bomber, 32% of the casualties were in Halifax's, and only 29.9% were Lancasters. Not much of a difference. But when you're talking about the air crews killed during the war, 57%, a little bit more than 57% were in Halifax's, and Lancasters suffered only 23.5% casualties.
Now, that data is very telling, isn't it? Because the Lancaster had this reputation as being sturdy. And as Jane said when she did her Halifax show, the Halifax bomber was part of the combined bomber offensive. We cannot ignore its contribution. It was a beautiful aircraft, but the data there does tell a story. It is fascinating.
So the Mark I's and Mark II's accounted for considerable casualties, but also many of the squadrons in the 6th Group were flying Halifaxes at that time in 44 and 45. So, for example, we'll get to this a little bit later. In one operation, there was 288 Halifaxes in the operation and only 3 Lancasters. So you can see that they were pushing the Halifaxes at the midpoint of the war. And so that's one reason why there was heavy casualties.
Okay.
You could see this spike in 43 of casualties. 29% of all Canadians in 1940, 29% of all casualties in 1943 were Canadian crews. And that number spiked again in 44 with 38.3% of all casualties were Canadians.
Mm. So now we're to the crew.
Yeah. So in mid 44, Donald McWilliam Sanderson arrived in England, and he continued his training from Canada and as a pilot. He's obviously with the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was only 22 years old. He hailed from Ontario, Canada. He was single, although he had a liaison with a young British woman in York, and which produced a son. He never knew that son, and it's not likely that he even knew that his girlfriend was pregnant at the time. So this is one tragedy that was very apparent then. He had a high school education. He was the only member of the NP711 crew that had military experience. He served as a sergeant in the Canadian Army Reserve in 40-41 before he enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Go ahead. On December 7th, 1944, before December 7th, 44, the rest of the crew had arrived in Bournemouth, went for their training, and then arrived at Leistadt. And on December 7th, Sanderson was tasked with selecting his crew. His job was to go to the briefing room, and there were dozens of freshly minted airmen, and his job was to go around the room and select his crew. It's kind of like speed dating. You spend 3 to 5 minutes with a man, determine whether he likes to fly, whether he's eager to engage in combat, and whether he can work as a team. That's only needed for the 2 air gunners, the wireless operator, and the bomber. And so he selected those men fairly quickly. The critical part of the team would be the flight engineer and the navigator, and I'll get to that in a second. So the first man that he selected was Nels Peter Highland Anderson. He was only 21 years old. He was from Manitoba, Canada. He had a primary school education. He was a farmer before the war. He came from a very large family, spoke Danish and English, and was just a very nice kid. Next one. The bomber that he selected was William James Gilmore. He was 32 years old. He was Canadian by birth, but he had lived in Seattle, Washington, and divided his time between Seattle and Eugene, Oregon. He was the only member of the crew that had a college education, and he was not working when he enlisted in 1942, I think. Go The tail gunner, Anderson would be the mid-upper gunner, and the tail gunner was Donald Edison Sherman. He was 20, came from Kingsville, Ontario, Canada. He had 2 years of high school, and he was a laborer. The navigator was the key person in this crew. He was Reginald Bertram Smith, Bert Smith to his family, and Smitty to the crew. He was 33. He was the oldest of the crew. He came from Sydney, Nova Scotia, had his high school education, and was an accountant. He had a keen attention to detail. He scored very high on his testing in Canada and in England on his navigation skills. But he wasn't loved by his instructors. He had what they termed as a negative personality, a dour disposition, and somewhat sarcastic. And they thought he was a great navigator, but he was not instructor material. Unlike Gilmore, who also scored high on his tests, but he's very sociable and very engaging with his instructors and with his fellow cadets. And he, it's believed that if he completed 25 operations or so on his tour, that he probably would have been selected as an instructor and remain in England to do teaching, but that didn't come to pass.
Of course.
Good. The wireless operator was William Wallace Wagner, my cousin. Billy to his family, Bill to the crew. He was 22. He's an American, born in Salinas, California. When his dad retired from Warner Brothers in 36 or 37, I think, they moved to his mother's hometown of Napanee, Ontario, Canada. He had some college and was a bank teller before the war. And last, James Wilson, the flight engineer, would come later. And he was with the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. He was the youngest of the group, Scottish, from Douglas, Scotland. He was a farmer. He was the only boy of a family full of girls. I think he had 5 or 6 sisters. And his great niece told me at one point that he had the itch to get off the farm and see the world. And that's one reason why he joined the RAF.
And it's just interesting, Rob, that this crew, like so many crews, whether they're American crews or British crews, they fulfill those cliches of having, the farmer and the working class guy and the college guy and the older one and the younger one and the outgoing one and the quiet one. It's how many times is that always true? Whether it's a tank crew or an air crew, there's always this mix of a complete contrast of personalities, but yet would galvanize to be a working unit despite their differences. I could never fail to be impressed by these random groups of people who are thrust together from completely different walks of life.
Sure, that's why this crew is a perfect microcosm of all crews. They all had the same thing. So the crew was selected on December 7th, 44. On January 1st, 45, they flew their first mission. And January was a bad month in terms of weather. There was a lot of downtime. But that first week, January 1st through January 8th, I believe, they flew 5 operations. And it was really grueling for a green crew. And they flew over Dusseldorf, Hanover, Ludwigshafen, and Stuttgart. And the Mark 7 they had was actually, it was not NP711. It was November Papa 776, nickname R. Roger. And crews then did not get a specific bomber to use throughout their tour. But pilots had a tendency to hang on to those bombers. So if they were conducting 15 operations a month or 14 operations a month, they might have flown that bomber 10 times, and then it was grounded for maintenance or what have you, and then they get the bomber back. Or through the whims of a higher echelon, it was assigned to somebody else for a couple operations. But the pilots had a tendency to hang on to aircraft that they were comfortable with. And Sanderson loved his R. Roger, the NP776. It was sturdy. It was reliable. It performed flawlessly. But like all Halifaxes and Lancasters, it had its quirks. Over Hanover, it lost its starboard outer engine, but it flew flawlessly. There was nothing wrong with it. It landed perfectly. On another occasion, he was forced to perform a corkscrew port maneuver to evade a ME-109, and it came out of that maneuver perfectly. And it handled very nimble, surprisingly for a bomber of that size. And on another occasion, heaters would go out in sub 30-degree temperature, minus 30-degree temperatures. On one occasion on a return trip, the flaps fell down over the English Channel, and Wilson and Sanderson had to disconnect the hydraulics to allow the wind to kick the flaps up and to allow them to land. So it had those quirks, but in every time that Sanderson had these problems, the R. Roger behaved the way it was supposed to behave. Mm-hmm. So they were very comfortable with this airplane. The only time they flew NP711 was during the Worms operation. So after the 8th, weather was pretty severe, and there was a lot of downtime, like I said. And so at that point, they decided to take a leave. Usually when the crews took leaves, this crew in particular, they would take a leave together. This crew would often go up to Scotland to Wilson's farm. They do a little hunting, go into the town to do a little drinking at the pubs, flirt with Wilson's sisters, that kind of thing, and then return back to Lindnaus. But to give you an idea about the downtime, in January, Mark 7s have recorded 581 hours of night operations. And they still had Mark 3s, of course, and they recorded 117 hours of night operations. So with 152 officers in the 408 alone, they managed 104 operations. The 408 did.
Wow.
In February, things increased dramatically. Mark 7 recorded 764 hours. The Mark 3 recorded 137 hours. They recorded almost twice as many operations in February with 245 personnel. So for the entire Bomber Command, that's an operation every other day. So they were always up, and there was little time for rest. And the conventional wisdom among air crews at that point was that operations 1 through 6, which they basically did on the first week of January, there's a lot of excitement. The adrenaline is flowing. They're finally in combat. All that training is paying off. They're in the thick of things. They're in the war. That's what they're there for. It's very exciting. Then around Operation 6, you start to question your own mortality. And you start to get scared. And you start thinking about what's going to happen to you. And that goes on for a long, long time. Usually between Operation 6 and Operation 14, you're terrified. And then after Operation 14 or 15, you kind of take on a fatalistic attitude. What's going to happen is going to happen, and you're going to either live or die. Doesn't make any difference. You're going to get the job done.
And in your experience of studying this, you think that applies no matter where the war is going generally, because we now know that by the spring of 1945, not that I'm dismissing the battles to come and I'm dismissing the missions to come, the war it's over the worst. We're over the hump, so to speak. The end is in sight. The losses are reducing. The end is. But even in those situations, you think that your average crew is still going about that fatalistic look as they would have been in 43 or 44 or any other part of the war.
Yes. Think about what the crew is going through when they're up in the air. I was fortunate enough to get Sanderson's journals from his family had written to my family about and sent his journals to my family. So I was fortunate to receive those journals, which he talks about his operations. And maybe he's doesn't want to make his family worry about him, but he was very optimistic. He loved flying. The adrenaline was flowing every time he got in the plane. he acknowledged that he had the jitters and had anxiety when he's on the ground, but when he's in the air, he was very busy and doing his thing. The same would go for Wilson, who was also very busy during operations. He would stand by Sanderson on takeoffs and landings, and when he wasn't doing that, he was monitoring the engines. So he was very busy. The other crew member would be Smith. Smith was also very busy. He was charting his course every 6 minutes. So he didn't have time to think about what was going on with flak or with night fighters. The same can't be said for the air gunners and for the wireless operator and for the air bomber. The air gunners, Anderson and Sherman, had a bird's eye view of what was going on outside. They could see the other aircraft next to them, and they could see aircraft being taken out by flak. Wagner was usually at his wireless operator station. To the left of him was a window with a blackout curtain. You're not supposed to look out that window during an operation. You don't want to give away your position with the light coming in from inside. But you're in the air for 7 hours. So inevitably, you could take a peek outside and see what's going on. And same with Gilmore. He was in the nose at the time. So you have an opportunity to witness what's happening to other bombers. And so you're in your own thoughts. You have radio silence. You can't talk to anybody. So you're alone with your own thoughts. You have the roar of the engines. If your heater's not working, you're freezing, and you're just sitting there. So inevitably, you're going to suffer from anxiety and from eventually from PTSD. And that's what we're going to talk about next, is the issue of PTSD.
Yeah.
So I call this the lie of lacking moral fiber. Early in the war, the military medical community understood that PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, was a real medical issue that needed to be treated medically, and air crews or even crews on the ground needed to be hospitalized if they suffered from severe PTSD. Bomber Command, in its infinite wisdom, didn't see it that way. They were losing more men that they could replace, and they needed every single man in the sky. So they came up with this policy called lacking moral fiber. And in my view, it's a cruel policy. A policy that it's a euphemism. Lacking moral fiber is a euphemism for cowardice.
Yeah.
So crews were faced with being accused of lacking moral fiber, cowardice, or continue to fly and take their chances. And most crewmen decided to take their chances. It would be dying would be better in their view than being accused of a coward. And I bring this up because during the leave that the crew took in January 15th, 1945, this would be a 9-day leave. So they weren't going to Scotland. They're going to see their family separately. So Bill Wagner took a flight to see his brother in New York City. Now, Richard Wagner was a captain in the U.S. Army. He was in the field artillery. He was in the Philippines and New Guinea, and he island hopped all the way up to Japan, and he was part of the occupational forces in Tokyo. He was part of the 31st Division. And Richard has seen a lot of combat, so he was combat seasoned. So his brother over dinner one night had told him that he had faked an illness to get out of an operation. He said he just couldn't bear to get in the plane, and he was convinced that he was going to die, and he was going to be killed sooner rather than later. There's no judgment from Richard on this. He's seen plenty of combat. He knows what it means to have these feelings. But Bill was taking a terrible risk by calling in sick and feigning this illness, because if he was caught, the consequences would have been severe. So there are two ways that Bomber Command handled these kind of issues. If you were caught faking an illness, they would have kept it pretty quiet, and they either would have convinced the airmen to continue flying, or forced the airmen to continue flying, or they might have given him a ground assignment, but it's unlikely. More than likely, he would have been stripped of his rank and court-martialed and just sent away. There are plenty of incidences during the war in which crewmen cracked up in the plane, cracked up publicly. Some outright refused to fly. There are a number of reasons. You'd see a fellow crew member be severely injured or killed. Bombers had a tendency to feel guilt over bombing cities in which civilians were killed. And some just literally and unscientifically, if I may say, went berserk.
Yeah.
And they caused some real problems. And sometimes the flight engineer or the navigator had to drop the bombs. So this was a real problem. You can go to the next one.
And it's just interesting. Yeah, I think myself and everybody watching this are now thinking, how would you not go through that process doing what these guys are doing? I think now the default would be to allow this to break you at some point. I can't imagine what it would be like to go into an aircraft flying over Germany with the risks and dangers they faced and not experience some kind of trauma mentally through that. I think that the exception would be to somehow breeze through it without any problems at all. It's extraordinary what these guys did and how they were treated. I know you're going to elaborate on it. Was by today's standards, it was really harsh.
I'm sure there are many air crews that found this exhilarating and look forward to operations like Sanderson did. But I think many more were just terrified and just grinned and bared the whole thing.
Yeah,
and just
the human reaction, the normal human reaction to be terrified when it's scary. It's yeah.
Here, this photo is of Richard when he was, I think he might have been a lieutenant at that point in the U.S. Army. He's on the left, and Bill Wagner is on the right here. This was taken in their hometown of their mother's hometown of Napanee, Ontario. Go to the next one. So lacking moral fiber or PTSD, at least in those early during World War II, manifested itself as fatigue, increased alcohol abuse, being irritable, losing interest in the tasks at hand, suffering multiple, I would say, emotional crises, and then just flying off, flying efficiency, flying efficiency in general. Go ahead. That's them. This is, I think this was taken in 1941 when Bill was a bank teller. He's still a civilian at this point. And Richard here on the right is still a lieutenant, I think. So each year, an estimated 3,000 cases of nervous breakdowns occurred in air crews, and 300 were determined as lack of confidence. 1/3 of the neuroses cases occurred in the RAF Bomber Command. So clearly, it was a very stressful situation for air crews. In the 70s and 80s, I interviewed a number of D-Day veterans, and more than a couple guys had told me that when they're on the ground and they had a break and they're looking up and seeing these bombers fly overhead, they would say to themselves, "Man, I wish I was in that bomber. I wish I was there instead of here," not knowing that the air crews were looking down at them saying, "Man, I wish I was down there instead of up here." So it's all kind of relative. So the LMF cases submitted to Bomber Command was like more than 3,000 airmen and over 700 officers. Those airmen who are classified as LMF and had LMF written on their medical records was 2,337 airmen and 389 officers. I want to make it clear, however, that none of the service records of the crew of NP711 had LMF on their records. They had no indication that they suffered from PTSD. In fact, I don't think any of them, except for one maybe, had any visits to the hospital or was sick. I know that in one point in early February that Wagner and Smith were grounded for one operation for having severe head colds. This I got from Sanderson's journal, but those don't even show up on their service records. So it must have been just a minor issue at that point. Go ahead. So all this comes to the Worms operation. Excuse me. Go ahead to the next slide. The Worms operation, primary target was to hit the railway station. This town had a population of 58,000. There was 288 Halifaxes, which I mentioned earlier, participating in this raid, and three Lancasters and 25 Mosquitoes. And all across all the squadrons of the 6th group, there was 334 aircraft that participated in this bombing. The Worms operation was deemed a success. 39% of the town was destroyed. 116,000 tons of bombs were dropped. 239 people, mostly civilians, were killed. 35,000 were left homeless, mostly civilians. And cooling towers, oil storage tanks, railway station, and oven houses, along with the railway station, was destroyed. I didn't get a chance to ask anybody in Worms when I was there about the front entrance to this railway station. It looks like it was untouched by the bombing, because that goes back, that design, that architecture goes back pre-war. But the two wings behind it are definitely of a modern design. Casualties in the Worms operation was 11 bombers lost, 22 crewmen killed, including the NP711, and 16 crewmen were captured. And ironically, one of the aircrafts that was in which the aircrew was captured had crashed, and that was one of the aircraft that Sanderson had flown for a while. Go ahead. So we don't know exactly what happened to NP711.
Just a quick question for you, Rob, before we carry on. Andreas, who lives in Germany, is saying, do you know if the cathedral was hit in Worms on that raid?
It was not.
No, there we are. Thank you.
Yeah. Like I said, we don't know exactly what happened to NP711. We knew it took off from Leistadt at 5:40 p.m. And across the English Channel. Go ahead to the next one. And then go ahead to the next one. And at about 8 p.m. across the German border, you can see Worms off in the distance. So it's still a ways away from the target. Next slide. About 20 minutes later, it was hit by flak from the ground. And I want to emphasize there was no night fighters in the sky. It's just flak. So if you look closely, you'll see a little flames on the fuselage. But what I think it was, from what I understand from witnesses on the ground, that the wing and at least one engine was on fire, because there's a considerable amount of flames coming from that plane before it crashed. Go ahead. Sherman, in the tail, had escaped the aircraft and over Wiesenheim, which was 2 kilometers east of Leistadt. But the plane was flying too low, and he was killed when he hit the ground. I wanted to introduce this slide because if you look to our right of the ammunition belt, you can see the sliding door.
Yep.
Sherman would enter the aircraft through the hatch and the midway at the fuselage, turn right, go down to the tail. He would put his parachute in a box outside of the gun turret. He would get into the gun turret, sit down, and close the sliding door. When he had to escape the gun turret, he had to open the door, take his parachute, put it on, get back inside the turret, close the door, rotate the turret 45 degrees, open the turret like we see here, then fall out backwards. So very cumbersome, very time-consuming. The fact that he got out at all is really a miracle. Next slide. I think this illustration is a Lancaster, but it illustrates perfectly how Sherman will fall out backwards out of the rear turret.
Incredible.
Yeah. And then the aircraft continued over Leistadt, and 2 miles west of Leistadt. It could not clear the hill and crashed into the mountainside. I think this is a perfect illustration of what the crew is going through. That night is a 3/4 moon. Visibility was perfect. Sanderson had a clear view of ahead of him, but the flak crews on the ground also had a clear view of all the bombers above. And so maybe by happenstance, I don't know, but they had a clear shot, and that's how this aircraft was taken down.
And I think when we had Donald Niebuhr, the Canadian historian, a few months ago, he did a show about German flak, and someone will correct me if I'm wrong on this. As the Third Reich is being pushed back and back into Germany, which is of course happening by this time of 1945, the Eastern Front is squeezing in, the Western Front is squeezing in. The Germans are bringing back their flak guns, so the concentration of flak guns is getting proportionally higher, even though the war effort is going against them, is because they're bringing them back. So if I'm wrong on that someone will correct me. So I'm sure he said that in 1945, flak was heavier than it had been earlier.
Yes, I think it was, and in fact, we'll get to the ground in a minute. But there was a heavy concentration in Western Germany of flak guns. In this case, I don't know if it's routine or not. But in this case, there's no night fighters at this point.
Right.
The night fighters were circling the target, waiting for the bombers to come or attacking the bombers as they came closer to the target, but none here.
Okay. And James Jeffries, our resident RAF expert, is saying, yes, that is how it was. So I got that one right. I was dabbling in air aviation, which is not my specialist field, but I got away with it. So I'm gonna quit making any speculations. I'm on a high now. That's it. Thanks, James, for backing it up. Whoa, I'm on a roll now. I should go and put a bet on or something.
This image here is a good example of what flak can do to an interior of a bomber. You can see the ammunition track up in the upper right hand area of the interior of the plane. Down below at the bottom, just barely, you can see a huge hole on the floor, and then this flak all over these holes all over the fuselage. So two things happen when you hit flak like this. First of all, your hydraulics are compromised. They're severed, and the pilot has little or no control over the plane. Two is the crew is cut to ribbons. And so either they're badly wounded or they're killed. So I always wondered how Sherman could get out this cumbersome way of parachuting out of a plane, still managed to get out when nobody else did. And I'm speculating at this point that the crew is badly injured or dead by the time it reached that hillside. I think that Sanderson was trying to clear the mountain, but we'll just never know.
Yeah.
On the ground in Western Germany, I think in an area near Speyer, if I'm pronouncing that right, which is a 1 or 2 hours southeast of Leistadt, there was like 10 to 12 flak guns, flak positions. And we can go to the next one. And manning those flak positions was one gentleman named Werner Rubenheimer. And he was a young teenager during the war. And he was in middle school when he started manning a flak gun. The whole school was drafted into manning the flak gun. They were marched down from the school down to the flak position with their teacher, and they would take their lessons at the flak gun. After a few weeks or after a couple of months, the teacher disappeared, and the kids were left on their own to study on their own. This is Werner Rubenheimer. A little bit later, when he's a little bit older, he towards the end of the war, he became a crew maintenance worker for the Luftwaffe. He said that when he was a kid, like old German kids at that point, they're loyal to the government. They're loyal to the Nazi regime. They thought that the enemy was evil, and they were, in his words, he didn't use brainwash, but he implied that they were just brainwashed into this thinking. So they're very excited to participate in the war. They're very excited to shoot down airplanes. It was only later that he realized that he's being lied to, and he had, as he put it, ran away from the Luftwaffe and surrendered to American troops. Here is when he's younger with his fellow classmates. That's Werner Rubenheimer on the right, the profile. Mm-hmm. So what had happened was that on one occasion, Mr. Rubenheimer told me that you never knew when you were hitting an aircraft with your gun. There are so many flak guns in the area that it could be anybody. And on one occasion, a fighter plane was hit by flak, but he was hit by flak over their position. He said he watched the fighter plane leave the area, then suddenly make a U-turn, come back, and dive straight for his gun position. He crashed right into the gun position. There's a huge explosion. 4 Luftwaffe soldiers and 4 of his classmates were killed. He was seriously injured. The crash left this huge, deep crater here. The only thing left of the aircraft was this propeller. The individual that you see in the white coat, that's a Russian POW who was conscripted to man the gun, as well as the kids and the Luftwaffe soldiers.
Wow.
Here we have the crash site on the hillside west of Leistadt and Bad Dürkheim. You can go ahead. Now, Leistadt and Bad Dürkheim, they're in a rural area. It's wine country. It's the German wine route, and there's many, many vineyards around. Even today, there's many vineyards around. But they are, even their remoteness didn't save them from bombings. In 1942, I believe Leistadt was bombed, and there was heavy casualties. A month after NP711 had crashed, Bad Dürkheim was bombed. They bombed a marshalling yard, and 300 people were killed. And this is typical of villages and rural areas that they become targets of bombings, although, at least in Leistadt, in this case of the village of Leistadt, there is no strategic value to bomb this small village. And as a consequence, villagers in rural areas were very unforgiving of bombers and of bomber air crews. It wasn't quite the same in urban areas. Urban areas had a tendency to give civilian ceremonies or military honors to dead Allied airmen. Even when the Nazi regime issued an edict banning such military honors, some urban areas would still do this. Not in Leistadt and not in Bad Dürkheim. When the plane crashed, there's a massive explosion, indicating that it was still carrying its bomb load. And there was a massive fire, and the debris field was about 1,000 meters wide. So when several villagers went up the mountainside to see if they can find the crew, the fire was too intense, so they had to wait until the next day. Next day, they went up. They recovered what they said was the remains of 3 English airmen, which is incorrect. There was the remains of 6 Canadian airmen, and they buried him in Leistadt Cemetery. You can go to the next one. Next slide.
Yep.
And this is Leistadt Cemetery. In the background, you can see the village. It's very small. And to the right, if you look closely, you can see some of the vineyards over there. And the next, this is Eric Weimann, and I'll talk about him in a little bit. He's a researcher, and he performs battlefield excavations. He took me on a tour of the crash site and of the cemetery, and he also introduced me to Werner Rubenheimer. The airmen of NP711 were buried at this site here. They were exhumed, I think, a year, maybe 2 years later, and that gravesite remained empty for many decades until about 10 years ago when they reused the gravesite. This is Eric, and he's showing a piece of incendiary bombs. To the go to the back there for a second. In the background, this general area is where the nose of the Halifax Mark 7 NP711 had crashed. Go ahead. This is next slide. This is part of the payload that the NP711 would carry. Go ahead. This is an incendiary bomb that Eric had found laying on the topsoil of the debris field, untouched for 73 years.
Wow.
And if you look, this is what the bomb looks like as it's loaded onto the aircraft. You can see that those are 4-pound incendiary bombs, and this would be the assembled cluster.
I was just saying, Rob, you were saying before we went live that you're not a proper military historian. This is outstanding. People are loving it. I mean, and you've got a bit of a cold and a sniffle as well. So this is really good. Believe me, I do a lot of these, and you're good.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Here we have Eric pointing out that he's standing on a fire break here, and the plane had hit the hillside. The nose hit the hillside. The plane laid to rest, or the debris laid to rest is more accurate, on the fire break and on this hillside here. You can't really see, but there's a lot of missing trees here. It's a lot of a sparse area because those trees never grew back and the vegetation never grew back. If you look to the right, next to Eric's hand, you can see more densely forest, and it's a very dense forest. So this part is kind of laid bare by the crash. And because of the massive explosion and the fire, you couldn't find a piece that's any longer than your arm. These are all very small pieces. Somewhat surprisingly, Eric found like 3 or 4 oxygen masks that were still intact, that were laying on the topsoil. They have wild pigs in the area, and I guess these wild pigs had dug them up and then just left them there. So, I mean, you can even today. Well, I think he's cleared up most of it, but it wouldn't be difficult to find more debris today.
Wow.
So Eric started excavating the wreckage of November Papa 711 in 2018. The pandemic came. He had to put things on hold, but he finished relatively quickly after that. His team performs a number of battlefield excavations. Usually a farmer or a resident will come across something and call him. He'll come down and take a look and determine whether if it's really a World War II wreckage. And then he would go to the General Directorate for Cultural Heritage for the Rhineland-Palatinate region and get a permit to do an excavation. Now, the General Directorate for Cultural Heritage is a state agency. The federal government has no role in battlefield excavations. It all belongs to regional agencies. And battlefield excavations in Germany is relatively new. Unlike in the United States with Civil War excavations, Civil War battlefield excavations, or in England or other European countries, Germany is very far behind. It's not something that Germans wanted for many, many years. But maybe 10, 15 years ago, maybe not that long ago, battlefield excavations of Allied crash sites became a little bit more common. And local villages and cities participated in not funding. Funding came from donations, but when the memorial, when Eric Weimann had decided to determine that the battlefield area would be a grave site, all of his excavations were treated as grave sites.
Right.
He would notify the local community, and there would be plans made while you're doing the excavation to erect a memorial. The local villages would participate in that by having the local officials speak at the memorial, perhaps donate the plaque or a granite rock to put the plaque on, those kind of things. They would do that. And so there was a number of Allied memorials over the years that these villages and towns would participate in. Because 3 or 4 generations have passed, time has passed, and so the view of Germans today is that these are liberators, not the enemy. So they're going to honor them. The same can't be said for German crash sites. Eric Weimann and his team would excavate German battlefield sites, and he would get his permits from the local state agencies, which were granted. And his habit was to find the aircraft, identify the pilot who flew the aircraft, which is what he did with NP711, and then he'd notify the families if he could find them. And more often than not, the German families had no interest whatsoever in participating in the memorial of their relative. They thought that it was in bad taste. They thought that perhaps they don't want to be associated with the Nazi regime, whether or not their relative was a member of the Nazi party or not, or it was just a pilot. It didn't matter. The mere association gave them a pause. So maybe times are changing. Maybe the younger generation is saying, sure, why not? But descendants of pilots and air crews that were killed fighting for Germany, if they're in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, they're a little reluctant to participate.
I mean, it's interesting. We did a show about remembrance in Germany last year, and my guest was saying that even expressing an interest in the war in Germany up until fairly recently was considered weird. Why would you want to be interested in that? Even if you're interested in something on the positive side, like, you know, investigating crashes or researching the history of a particular individual or town, it was considered odd. Whereas when we talked about the dam busters 2 or 3 nights ago, if you live in the UK or living in the US or Canada, having interest in World War II is considered a very normal thing to be interested in. It's that joke about when men get to 40 years old, they either become interested in smoking meats or World War II. That's the kind of the meme that goes around. But Germany still, understandably, has a bit of a different attitude to showing interest in an era that was obviously a very, 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 very tragic one for them, as it was for the rest of the world. So it's interesting that as time passes, the Germans understanding, and Andreas is watching us today, he's from Germany, it is changing, but there's a lot of baggage that comes with the whole interest in World War II if you live in Germany. It's
evolving, and the youngest generation now is shown a little bit more interest, but nevertheless there's still considerable sensitivity about this issue. And in my conversations with the cultural heritage people, is that they do not want battlefield memorials, whether it's Allied or German, to be tourist sites. Like in the United States, all those Civil War battlefields, for example, are tourist sites. They have gift shops and they got cafes. I know that in England they have cafes and gift shops and what have you. So they attract tourists. The concentration camps, museums are a little bit different, but still it's a tourist destination for many people. In Berlin, the Gestapo headquarters, which I think was bombed during World War II, they erected a museum. So that might be a little bit more touristy, but it's more of a museum.
Yeah.
So as far as the battlefield memorials, they want it treated as a cemetery, as a gravesite, which is what, to Eric Weimann's credit, was what he's been doing.
Right.
And so they want people to come to reflect and to ponder Germany's future, Germany's past, and the men and women on both sides who gave their lives for their country. So that's what they want. I don't think you'll ever see them as tourist sites.
No. So we've got a couple of slides to go now. So we're going to wrap up the personal stories. Then we've got a few questions for you, Rob. But yeah, this brings it back to your cousin.
Yeah. So Bill Wagner and his crewmates were declared missing in action on February 22nd, 1945. And for the next 7 months, the families of all the crew members had no idea what had occurred to their loved ones. Like I said, they had very little detail about the crash itself and what became of their loved ones. There was a number of letters from the Royal Canadian Air Force to these families, but all of them were rather vague, basically saying, your son is missing in action. We don't know what happened to him. We don't want you to, they implied that maybe you should think of the worst, I guess. But they never came out and said they're presumed dead. That might come out a little bit later. But from February 1945 to October or November 1945, they had no clue. And I think what made matters worse was the good intentions of other flyers and other air crewmen who would visit these families. Some families wrote to my family that Royal Canadian Air Force crews would visit them at their home, encourage them, say, your son might be alive. He probably is alive. He probably is a POW, and they missed the count. They missed his name, or he's hiding out in Germany somewhere. He has a good chance of coming home. And I think that raised their hopes, only to be dashed in October, November of 45, when the official word came that they were killed in action. And I bring this up because Richard had told me that his father suffered a lot during these 7 months. And Bob Wagner had died in 1950 at the age of 58. And Richard is convinced that the strain of not knowing what happened to his son led to early death.
Wow.
And so go ahead to the next slide. On August 6, 2022, they had a memorial. The EU was represented, the RAF was representative, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and the German Luftwaffe was also represented, and family members from Wilson, Wagner, because I was there myself, and the Sanderson family were there and gave eulogies. It was very touching. And this is at the base of the mountain where the crash occurred. The mountain is a little bit too remote and difficult to get to. So they put the memorial at the mountain, at the base of the mountain.
I mean, what an amazing story, and the fact that it has a conclusion. Although, as you said there, so many relatives of these young men would have died long before this monument came up. They would have never had the complete, satisfaction of knowing the story from beginning to end. So it's to your credit and the people who've been working with you on this that you've completed this story of at least the descendants and the rest of us watching can understand this story. It's been really remarkable. Thank you very much for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
And we've got a few questions for you. So we'll put them up on screen. So is there a formal centralized recording of plane crash sites in Germany?
Not that I know of.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
Yeah.
David is asking, did you investigate the National Archives in Canada for your research?
I did. And that's where I got the service records for all the crew members.
Super. And Joost, who did a fantastic show with us about the 8th Air Force Mission 760, is saying, no question, just wanted to congratulate Rob for this presentation. So that's just someone, another guest presenter giving you kudos for your presentation there. So thanks for that. So in terms of, you said you're not a military historian. This is a very much a personal project for you. And that's, we understand the connection to it. But do you think you'll return to World War II? Do you think there's some, you've done this really well. You've seen this project from beginning to end. Is World War II going to draw you for something else, do you think?
Well, I talked to Eric about a potential of profiling his team for battlefield excavations. I want to explore that a little bit more. And I'm particularly interested in battlefield excavations that involve German aircraft. And I want to get a better picture of German airmen's role in the war and what their families went through. And my conversation with Werner Rubenheimer, the teenage flak soldier, was very enlightening. So I think from that point of view, I'll tackle that probably next year.
Okay. Another question from Sheldrake, who's on himself next week, talking about artillery. I may have missed it, but where are the crew buried, or rather, where are their markers?
They are their final resting place is Rheinberg War Cemetery, which is about 3 hours drive north of Leistatt.
And are they together as a crew, or are they?
They are. You know, Sherman's remains were recovered separately because he was buried in Wiesenheim. So he has his own gravesite, and then the remaining 6 crew members all have their own gravestones, but they're buried in a common grave.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, I think that is it for questions there, except when you've concluded some study about Luftwaffe crews, I think we'll come back and talk about it. And remind you that the link to your film is in the description below. So having seen this presentation, they can go and see, and they will see footage of you going up the mountain in Germany and meeting the various people and the memorial ceremony. It was enlightening, and I'm glad that there's some overlap, but obviously your presentation today is you're saying it a different way you did in the film. So they entirely work together, dovetail together to give a complete picture of this. And so for someone who said that they're not a military historian, you've done a superlative job at this. So thanks very much.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity that you gave me to do this.
No, thank you very much. The pleasure is all mine. So, folks, I will see you again tomorrow morning if you're in the UK, or very, very late tomorrow night if you're in the States, or tonight, I think it is, for our presentation about Kokoda again, and David Cameron is joining us for that. So that'll be tomorrow, and then next on Monday it's artillery. So, folks, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much, Rob, for sharing your expertise. Thank you, everybody, for your questions, and I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Very good. Thank you. Bye.